Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 10, Lesson 4. War is upon us once more. The War of 1812 is a sometimes overlooked war between the USA and Britain. It's kind of like a little DLC campaign you might have downloaded for Fallout 4. The main game may be done, the Revolution, but there's a little extra at the end, which is kind of like the War of 1812. Today's lesson is on the shorter end. Well, it was on the shorter end, but there's a lot of room for supplemental material, which I, of course, added. So if you read through the lesson in the book, it might seem short, but the lesson that I made ended up being pretty standard size. This war has the invasions of Canada, battles on the high seas, and, of course, the burning of Washington, D.C. Crazy times. So we're going to get right to it. So, the Americans found themselves at war in 1812. Again, another war. Here's the disposition of American military assets. We have 7,000 well-trained soldiers, 5,000 new recruits, 50 to 100,000 poorly trained militias. We remember militias, right? But the Navy was in better shape than it had been in the Revolution. We had ordered 6 new highly advanced frigates, like the USS Constitution and the Constellation and ships like that. I've actually linked frigates here. Oh, yeah, there we go. A sailing warship of a size and armament just below that is a ship of the line. So it's sort of like a cruiser. Let's get to it. So the Navy's in decent shape, but the Army not so much. The old commanders from the Revolution, your experienced guys, were pretty much too old to fight now, so we couldn't draw on that those experienced leaders. There was a problem that not everyone was on board with the war. Some called it Mr. Madison's War. The Warhawks thought that they would quickly defeat Britain once more, but they may have underestimated, in fact they did underestimate, the strength of the British and their native allies. So the war begins in July 1812. General Hull led an American army from Detroit to Canada to fight Tecumseh. So we have a Native American ally of the British. We know Tecumseh doesn't really like the Americans. The short story is General Hull lost, and multiple attempts to take Canada failed. It was determined that as long as the British controlled Lake Erie, taking Canada was impossible. So with that in mind, one of the most famous heroes of 1812 was Commodore Hazard Perry. Perry was essentially sent to Lake Erie to take it from the British. So he literally went up there with his men and built a small fleet to engage the small British fleet that was holding the lake. These two fleets ended up clashing on September 10th of 1813 in a fierce and brutal naval conflict. But Commodore Perry ended up winning. Sort of an underdog story, an upset for the British, and that's part of the reason why it's such a famous story today. You can actually go see the flagship Niagara, which was one of Perry's ships, up on Lake Erie. I think it's a recreation. It's not the original ship, but it's a fascinating museum up there. The Maritime Museum is right by the pier, right on Main Street, up in downtown Lake Erie. If you'd like to learn more about the battle, there's this cool video here. It's about 10 minutes long. It goes into much more detail on the Battle of Lake Erie. It's a really good story. I saw on the internet they might be making like a movie about it, like sort of a Master and Commander type movie. Very historical, but action-packed. So the U.S. actually managed some other significant victories as well, particularly in the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S. fleet won a number of victories, and the American privateers once more took a toll on British shipping. Remember, privateers are like government-sanctioned pirates. One of the most famous naval battles of the war was a battle between the USS Constitution, one of our frigates, and the HMS Guerriere. You can check out the video below for the recap. It's only 2 minutes, but it's a pretty epic naval battle. It's where the Constitution earned its nickname of Old Ironsides because cannonballs would literally bounce off its hull. After American forces controlled Lake Erie, British and native forces in the area sort of lost their edge. General Hull cut off native forces trying to retreat from Detroit. Tecumseh was actually killed in this battle. It was called the Battle of the Thames. American forces then moved into Canada and burned the Canadian Parliament to the ground. At the time, the city was called York. Now it's called Toronto. Despite a number of victories in Canada, the U.S. was still unable to conquer it and take it from the British. After the death of Tecumseh, the Indian Confederation that he had built fell apart. The British Native Alliance also fell apart. This was basically really bad news for the natives. Andrew Jackson, who we're going to learn about more very soon later in this lesson, led an attack on the Creek tribe in 1814 and defeated them soundly. The Creek were pretty much forced to surrender most of their lands. You have more of Americans pushing Indians off their lands through essentially conquest. So the British had been fighting two wars up until the year 1814. Remember, they had been fighting France and Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, but the war with Napoleon ended in 1814, and now Britain that had been split, fighting two fronts, could now focus on America, and they sent a significant force that landed in the Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C. They sort of threw aside the paltry defense, which was pretty much just militia defending the outskirts of Washington, D.C. They sort of blew them aside like a leaf blower in the autumn, and they started burning down every government building they could find. It's a good depiction here. They set the White House on fire, which at the time was only called the Presidential Mansion. They also set the Capitol building on fire. Not a great time. If a thunderstorm had not rolled in, they perhaps could have burned both buildings down to the ground, but both survived to this day because a thunderstorm rolled in. Instead of occupying the city of Washington, D.C., the British moved on to Baltimore, which is very close, where American forces actually repelled the attack they were ready for at this time. A British fleet moved to basically maneuver on the city and invade, but they were held in check at the bay by artillery fire from Fort McHenry. The fort survived a full night of attacks on September 13, 1814. A local lawyer, Francis Scott Key, witnessed the attack and in the morning penned a poem about what he saw. This poem was called The Star-Spangled Banner, and it recalled what he saw and felt that night and in the morning at that battle over Fort McHenry. You can still see the actual Star-Spangled Banner, the flag that flew over Fort McHenry that night that Francis Scott Key saw in the morning, and he knew that the fort was still in American hands. It's at the American History Museum in Washington, D.C. There's a picture here. I don't know how they got, because this thing's so old you're not allowed to take pictures of it. But it is a glorious sight, and perhaps maybe it's a history teacher thing, or a veteran, or whatever, but I really I started to tear up when I saw it. It's a great thing to behold, to see that piece of history. While all of this was happening in the South, Washington was being burned, a British force tried to move on New York from Canada. The British wanted to take the key city of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain in New York, but the plan fell apart when basically the British naval force on Lake Champlain was defeated by an American naval force on the lake, forcing the British once more to withdraw back to Canada. It was essentially at this point that the British decided that this wasn't going to be easy, winning another war in America, and it just wasn't going to be worth the effort. So representatives of the U.S. and Britain met in Ghent, Belgium in December 1814 and signed the Treaty of Ghent. The funny thing about this treaty is it ended the war but never really addressed any of the problems that caused the war. There's no mention of neutral rights, which was null and void now that the war with France was done. There was no mention of impressment, no promise to stop it, and no land really changed hands. The Creek lost their land, but the U.S. didn't gain any of Canada or anything. So the treaty is signed, but there were no phones back then or email, so no one told Andrew Jackson in New Orleans or the British force sent to attack them. The Battle of New Orleans is sort of tragic in that it didn't have to happen. Jackson and his men were well entrenched behind cotton bales and whatnot within New Orleans, and when the British marched on the city to try and take it, they were defeated soundly by an entrenched Andrew Jackson and his forces. This victory, although this battle didn't have to happen, it did help Andrew Jackson, that it sort of propelled him to fame, in which he would use to ride to the highest office of the land. But that's a story for another day. To close up the lesson, let's summarize what the war accomplished. Now remember, the Federalists never cared for what they called Mr. Madison's War. In December, right before the war ended, they had met and had a convention, drafting their grievances and even a few amendments to the Constitution to protect their interests. A few even still wanted to secede. Well, it turns out this was right when the USA would win the war and the treaty would be signed, so their grievances go over about as well a fart in church. They are seen as unpatriotic and lose all respect with the public. This essentially destroyed the Federalist Party as a political force, leaving only the Democratic Republicans. Federalist ideals did live on somewhat in the new wing of Republicans known as the Warhawks. See, the Warhawks favored strong military, expansion and trade, and all those things require a larger government, which is a bit of a change from the very small government of Republican, like Thomas Jefferson. After the War of 1812, Americans had a new sense of pride. They had stood toe-to-toe once more with a major world power and came on top. And the rest of the world, they noticed this too. It sort of gave the U.S. some good standing in the world. For your assignment, you have a simple quiz, 5 questions. If you read the lesson or read the book, you should do just fine and ace it. That's it. This is a really exciting lesson, but that's the end of Chapter 10. So tomorrow, study day, followed by test day. All right. Have a wonderful day. Let me know if you have any questions.